talking about observation of the Cooper pair density modulation state in iron-based superconducting flakes. Please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Stevan Nadj-Perge, and I would like to start by thanking the organizer for inviting me to this great virtual workshop. And today I'm going to tell you about our STM results on the observation of the Cooper pair density modulation state. This work has been done primarily by my former postdoc, Lingyuan Kong, together with graduate student Hyunjun Yuran in Eli. And we had a great theoretical support by Professor Patrick Lee and Mikhail Papai. And we got iron-based superconductors from Brookhaven National Lab from Professor Gente Gu. I should definitely mention that Lingyuan, who is now assistant professor at Westlake University, played a critical role in doing this work. Since I'm actually coming from a very different community, he's the one who brought expertise on the iron-based superconductors to our lab. So iron-based superconductors, for the most part, until now, can be studied in a bulk form where people would change the doping concentration and pressure, and kind of all great experiments can be done in the past, for the most part, in a bulk. And also there were experiments done in MBE grown films, an example we saw in the previous talk. But one of the things that we actually kind of were set to do is explore the properties of van der Waals flakes. That is the flakes that you get when you actually exfoliate a bulk crystal in a thin form. And these are the thicknesses of, like, let's say 10 to 100 or even hundreds of layers, whether some of these properties of iron-based superconductor change under these conditions. So as I mentioned, I'm coming from a very different community. I'm actually coming from community of van der Waals materials. For the last 10 years or so, we were studying twisted bilayer graphene, multilayer graphene, and all other kinds of van der Waals structures. So that is a very rich field. And when Lingyuan came to our lab, he actually brought this expertise of iron-based superconductors, and we kind of wanted to see what can we do when exfoliated these films, and tried to actually measure them with STM. So we kind of set up to kind of bridge the gap between these two communities that are largely, to the large extent, not overlap in our conferences and also in meetings and discussions. So since this is maybe new for you, in order to kind of make the samples for our studies, the bulk superconductor iron-based iron selenium telluride that we studied here has to kind of go through sets of fabrication steps, which I kind of illustrate here. So essentially, for this work, we kind of developed a technique where we would stack graphite HBN, hexagonal boron nitride, and iron-based superconductor on top of each other by consecutively using the polymer stamping method. And then, in addition to that, on top of this superconductor, we would place a graphite electrode that would enable electrical contact to the stack. So in the end, you kind of end up with this stack that has this electrode, and this is all done in a argon-filled environment, in a glove box, and then transferred into the STM. So the end result, or the end kind of device, if you want to call it device, looks like this, where you have your stack of iron selenium telluride sitting on an atomically smooth substrate, which is made by boron nitride and graphite, and then you kind of do a standard STM measurements where you apply a bias on the contact and you collect the current. And this is the optical image of a device. So essentially, the device looks, this particular here flake is the flake of the iron-based superconductor, iron selenium telluride. Here is a kind of a cartoonish picture. And what you do when you exfoliate these thin flakes, you get actually flakes in regions of different thickness. So you can kind of probe the thickness dependence of various quantities that you can measure with your STM. And I kind of want to emphasize the importance of paying attention to the fabrication details here, because in the beginning, essentially, we will always get the contaminated surfaces. So this is just a series of attempts that Lingyuan made in fabricating the samples and transferring them into the STM. And the crucial difference between cleanliness of the samples and, of course, suitability for STM studies turned out to be this kind of a time frame from depositing this very air-sensitive iron selenium telluride flake and in a glove box. Then the clock starts, and at the time until the sample is actually in the STM chamber. And if you keep this time frame within like 1 hour or so, you can find the very clean regions on the sample and perform these measurements that I'm gonna tell you about. So if you now zoom into this sample, you can actually resolve the square lattice of the sample, and you can establish basic properties such as, you can establish you can measure the superconducting gap. You can establish that if you measure the large range of energies, that the system behaves almost as like a semi-metal. There's the Fermi energy is very low in this system. And if you measure TC by averaging all the spectrum over the large areas and increase your temperature, you can see that the TC of this flake superconductor is about 12 Kelvin, which is very similar to the bulk values. Okay. However, there are many important differences, and one of the important differences is that if you measure now across many different regions in this sample, you actually can see that the step height, as you go from one area to another area of the sample, actually varies. So the step height is not homogeneously distributed. And most importantly, it's actually much bigger than the bulk value of the step height, which is around 6 angstroms. So we consistently get values that are around 7 angstroms when you average over areas that are around tens of microns. So that was kind of first kind of hint that, in these flakes, you might expect something unusual to happen just because, these flakes are because of the exfoliation process are going through this kind of fabrication, which affects the step height. Another kind of first important hint that we are dealing with a slightly different system than the bulk superconductor was obtained when we started performing QPI measurements on the system. Of course, in bulk, this was established 15 years ago, 16 years ago now. Essentially, this is the kind of the band structure of the iron selenium telluride. And then if you do the QPI, you actually get the main scattering vectors, which in this particular case is the scattering from the gamma to M pocket and from M to M or gamma to gamma pocket, which produce these vectors of Q3 and Q2. In contrast, when we do similar experiment on our flakes, we actually got that the Q2 scattering vector, which is dominant in the bulk, is actually absent. And this turns out to be important hint to explain the kind of the main phenomena that I will show you in the next few slides. Okay. So another thing that is kind of important to compare. So this, if you vary the composition between like between iron selenium and iron telluride, you actually get this kind of increase in the lattice constant that corresponds to our measured step height. But even if you would go from iron selenium to all the way to iron telluride, you wouldn't get to the point where we measured of 7 angstroms, which means that that these kind of layers on the flakes are relatively more decoupled than in the bulk. And the crucial point is, what are the kind of consequences on this to electronic states in this material? So what we set up to do is we actually measure the gap, superconducting gap, as a function of a spatial position, and you can tell from the previous measurements that in this system you can actually expect that the superfluid is inhomogeneous. In other words, the gap is very inhomogeneous as you go to different parts of the samples of the sample. But if you actually zoom in on the bulk crystals and you look at the atomic scale in the bulk, you will get that the gap is constant in space. So if you would zoom in a very small regions of some angstroms of a couple of nanometers, and you focus on the bulk samples, there is the gap is spatially uniform. So now, if you do very similar experiment on the thin flakes, you actually get a kind of a surprising result. And the surprising result, which is kind of a main result of our kind of study, is that now if you look at the spatial profile of the gap by taking kind of a line cut across the surface, you would get that the gap value oscillates on a very small length scales, on the length scales that are commensurate with the unit cell of this material, and this variation is actually can be quite large, up to like 30 to 40%, as you can see from example here. And we did this measurement in variety of settings on variety of surfaces. And what we found is that this actually happens in many different areas of the sample. So here are some examples where we essentially just kind of tracked the complicated trajectory around this flake and measure at various points this kind of spatial variation. And we find it everywhere where the flake is sufficiently thin. So essentially here we have a control point, unintentionally created thin point where the sample thickness was around 200. So in this particular region of the sample, the thickness was around 200 nanometers. And here we see a constant gap value. But in all of these regions where the flakes are really thin, you see this oscillation, and this oscillation appears commensurate with the lattice spacing of the iron selenium telluride. Another kind of crucial point is that this is very robust effect. So if you apply magnetic field and you try to suppress superconductivity, or you scan in the vicinity of the vortex, you will actually see that this periodicity remains present and doesn't change the periodicity. These are some examples of the measurement at 6 Tesla. And for the most part, the intensity of this oscillation kind of remains large of tens of percent. Another kind of key observation is that even if you purposely go on disordered area where where the gap is very inhomogeneous, you see similar oscillations. Now you see a lot of in-gap state and a lot of things that are happening in this gap, but the predominant oscillation still remains, and it doesn't change the periodicity. And finally, the third kind of observation here is that this is observed at base temperature, which is 400 millikelvin in our system, at 2 Kelvin, at 4 Kelvin, 7 Kelvin, and all the way up to 9 Kelvin or so, very close to the TC values, which was 12 Kelvin for this sample. So now we can ask ourselves, what is this oscillation? Is this a pair density wave, or is this something trivial? And the point is that the answer is no. The idea is that this oscillation is commensurate with the lattice of the crystal, and it's very strong in a sense. It's in the highest. It reaches highest value of 40% of the gap. So it's also not like coming from the trivial lattice potential. And on this graph, we just plotted this variation of the gap as a function of TC for various compounds, and you can see that in these flakes, this variation can be exceptionally exceptionally high. And this doesn't really also fit into the conventional pair density wave state, because in a pair density wave you expect some periodicity that is on the length scale that are of couple of unit cells, or it can be incommensurate with the unit cell. However, I should mention that this sublattice modulated superconductivity was actually, at the time of our work, also being proposed in the context of Kagome superconductors. So it was kind of theoretically hypothesized around the same time as our work. So another thing, we can kind of try to provide a little bit more insights in what's going on with this, what's the origin of this modulation. And to do that, we kind of concurrently took topography and perform mapping across this topography, collecting the spectroscopic data, which is typically done in STM experiments. And based on that, you can kind of, collect data reflecting the local density of states at certain energy outside the gap or inside of the gap. But what you can also do is you can actually track the size of the gap as a function of the position. And if you do that, you get two kind of related images, but these images are not completely the same, as this lower map again shows the oscillating portion of the gap value. To kind of further clarify these images, you can do Fourier transform filtering, which is again something typically done in STM, where you would just kind of filter around areas, taking into account the peaks in the Fourier transform, characteristic peaks, and then you would get this kind of maps where you can kind of more clearly identify the features that coming from from topography coming from the unit cell or the atomic unit cell and the corresponding gap sizes. And what's important in this plot is that these peaks here in the topography, in the peaks in the gate map, they don't really coincide, which is to tell that if you focus on these high peaks are selenium atoms, they are kind of forming these kind of intermediate portions of the gap. But now if you focus on the iron atoms can either have a gap minima or a gap maxima, depending where exactly in which region of the sample you sit in, and also whether whether for this particular region you are on the sitting on the iron Y atom or X atom, depend on as kind of highlighted by this directionality. So what is kind of to explain this behavior, we collaborated with Michal and Patrick, who actually figured out that if you would introduce a model which breaks glide mirror symmetry, you could actually, in addition to that, introduce the nematicity. You would get exactly the same result as we observed. So essentially, if you would assume that there is kind of a nematic transition here that is happening along pi direction, which is direction, this is diagonal direction pointed out here by the vertical line, you would actually explain the observations that we saw. So essentially, in this particular configuration, if you assume that there is different coupling in this direction than this direction between the iron atoms into two sublattices, you would get essentially the periodicity of the superconducting gap, which is exactly what we found in our experiment. And the important consequence of this
Please wrap
model,
up in one or
yeah,
two minutes.
yeah,
Thank
yes,
you.
yeah, sure. I'm almost done. The important consequence of this is that you should be able to see this in a normal density of states, not just in a superconducting gap, which is exactly what we do. So if you are above the gap, you also see this kind of slight difference in the density of states, which is amplified then further in the superconducting state. And this is also done, you can also see this in the Fourier transform of the conductance map. So let me kind of skip this, but show what we kind of believe is happening in these samples. So in contrast to bulk and the contrast to MBE grown films, we expect that in our samples, essentially, that there are slightly more hold up in comparison to monolayers, where our dominant Fermi pocket is on gamma, and it's kind of a hole-like, and that actually explains all the QPI data that we obtained on this sample. So let me just kind of wrap up, and essentially what I want to make my main point is that in thin flakes, because of this kind of change in the electronic structure and also the nematic transition in this particular QT3 direction, gives you rise to this pair density modulation state, which was not observed before in other systems. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm apologies for going over time, and just kind of say that the work is kind of inspiring new theoretical frameworks which kind of go deeper in understanding our data and proposing some concrete consequences that could potentially be measured. Thank you.
Thank you for the Professor Nadj-Perge's nice talk. Any questions from the audience? maybe I can ask a naive question. I'm not too familiar with. Do you expect to see similar modulations of the gap in other iron-based superconductors?
Well, I think here the main thing is the kind of this exfoliation process,
Mm.
which changes essentially the electronic structure of the system slightly. And I could imagine that there were other iron-based superconductors that would exhibit the same nematic transition. But in a broader concept of things, we know from the van der Waals materials that kind of I'm mostly working on, that properties of materials are actually changed a lot when you thin them down. And I think here the inspiration is that many of these strongly correlated and unconventional superconductor materials would probably go through the same phenomenology. So if you thin them down, and especially in the case where your Fermi energy is very low, you could expect to change their properties in a non-trivial ways. Whether you will see this particular state, it's unclear, but I would kind of just inspire that these are kind of experiments we're doing.
I see.
Yeah.
Have you considered trying introducing strain tuning to
Uh,
couple to this pneumaticity?
yeah, so that's kind of one of the things, one of the directions that we are considering.
Mm.
It's not super easy experiment because you're kind of adding another layer of complications, but definitely something that is worth looking into.
I see.
Yeah.
Any questions? Other questions from the audience? Okay, then we thank Professor Nadj-Perge